Hey, I'm Mike Degree, and welcome to Sermon in Small Bites. We just finished up week 2 of a sermon series we're in right now called The Feasts. And this past Sunday, our discussion was all about feast number 3, and that is first fruits. And in Leviticus chapter 23, we learned that God called his people to give the first of the harvest, trusting that he would give the rest of the harvest. And we talked about how challenging it was that they were called to give in that way, because giving the first of the harvest, it was a lot of work. In order for them to give the harvest, they had to actually work for the harvest. They had to do the planting and the tilling and the waiting, and it was just a whole process. They had to do the waiting and the watering. So growing a harvest, it was no walk in the park. And so for God to ask his people to sacrifice what they worked so hard for, I could imagine was a challenge. And the second reason it was a challenge is because the weather was just unpredictable. You just never knew what the weather would be. Maybe too much rain, too little sun. You just never know. So they would be required to give the first of the harvest. They didn't know if the harvest would actually come because of the weather, because of pestilence, because of disease. So it was just a lot of work. So they were faced with a huge task, and yet they were still willing to give the first of their harvest. And the question is, why were they willing to do that? And I think they were willing to give the first of the harvest because they remembered the God who gave to them first. They remembered the God who saved them from Egypt. They remembered the God who was calling them to be his special nation. And they remembered the God that was bringing them into the promised land. So for them, they probably reasoned, what's risking a sheaf of grain in comparison to what God has already given them? God had given so much to them, and the same God that gave a ton to them was the same God that also can give a ton to us as well. If you're a Christian, God has given you forgiveness. God has given you a family. God has given you fellowship. God has given you a fresh start. And so for us today, I think we should be asking ourselves a similar question. What's risking some comfort or convenience in comparison to what God has already given to us? God has given us his son. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20, it talks about first fruits, and God provided our first fruits, Jesus, from among the dead. So we, like the Israelites, should be willing to give on God's terms, trusting that he will give on his terms. We don't have to be farmers to give, but we can give our lives to the kingdom first, trusting that he will give us what we need later. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. We can give our lives to following Jesus, trusting that we will change because of Jesus. Mark chapter 1, verse 17. We can give our money cheerfully, trusting that God will bless us abundantly. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 through 8. And so if you're watching this, I want to encourage you to give on God's terms, trusting that God will give on his terms. And if you want to catch the rest of this sermon, I know that was a lot of detail, not a lot of context. If you want to catch the rest of this sermon, you can go ahead and do that. Go to our YouTube page, or you can click the link in the description. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and have an awesome day.